Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hey there, podcast listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. I am truly thrilled that you are here, and I hope, we're in the thick of summer, right in the middle of it, and I really hope that you are finding some time, at least a little bit of time for some rest and relaxation, that you are, finding those moments to connect with your kids in a perhaps more fun or more relaxed way than you're able to do during the school year, and that there is some joy coming into your world as an individual and as a parent right now. I am actually on vacation as we speak. I am taking some time off to spend with my family. And so what I'm doing this week is bringing to you an interview that originally aired during the 2023 Safe Parenting Summit. And it's an interview with someone who I think, well, first of all, is incredibly knowledgeable and that is really impactful. Now, if you found me, discovered my work and the podcast and my coaching and all of that through the 2023 Summit, there's a good chance that you have heard this interview. Even if that's the case, I encourage you to listen to this one again, because I think, that summit aired a year and a half ago nearly. And, unless you listen to it in the last month or 6 weeks, even if you've heard it before, there is still, I find that when I listen to things over and over, I get something new. I hear something new, or am reminded of something that I had forgotten about. So definitely encourage you to give it a listen again. And if you didn't hear this interview, if you weren't a part of the 2023 Summit, or you missed this particular session, then I hope you will get as much out of it as I intended. So like I said, this was part of the Safe Parenting Summit. And, we focused a lot on body safety in the summit, both in 2023 and in 2024. But there are some elements of safety that I think, are really important that we address as well. And so that's really what today's interview is. So you'll hear me introduce the guest in much more detail, but I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Renée Hopkins. Renee is the CEO for the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. And that is an organization based here in the Seattle, Washington area. The majority of the work that the Alliance does is Washington based, but obviously they are tuned in to what's going on nationally and even internationally. And so whether you live in Washington or not, I think you'll get a lot out of this interview. And, if you don't live in Washington, the information that Renee shares may give you some ideas of ways to engage in this issue if it's one that matters to you closer to home. So what I appreciate about this interview is that it is absolutely fact-based. It's not judgment-based. It's not shame-based. Renee doesn't go in and say, everyone should get rid of their guns. But what she does is share really important factual information and then gives you some actionable tools to help keep your children safer. So I think you'll get a lot out of it. I know I learned in the course of this interview, and I hope you will as well. So without further ado, Renée Hopkins. All right, welcome everyone to the next session of the Safe Parenting Summit. It is my true pleasure to introduce you to Renée Hopkins. Renee is the CEO for the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, and as the CEO, she oversees the development and execution of the Alliance's strategic plan for its 501c3, 501c4, and electoral activities. Prior to joining the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, Renee served as the founding executive director of the Seattle Police Foundation for 14 years, working on groundbreaking juvenile justice reform in King County, which is my home county here in Washington. And she also worked with homeless youth in Eastern Washington. In her 6 years with the Alliance, she's led the organization to become the leading state-based gun violence prevention organization in the country. They work on passing ballot initiatives, electing a gun violence prevention majority in the Washington state legislature, working with systems partners to develop the best practice models for implementing gun laws, and more. She was named one of Seattle Magazine's most influential people. And for those of you who are not from Seattle, that's a big deal here in our local town. So Renee, thank you so much for being here to share your wisdom. I'm so grateful to have you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
You know, as I was putting together this summit and thinking about safety from a bunch of different angles, obviously, I know a lot of parents worry about gun safety and keeping kids safe from things like school shootings and, which the media loves to talk about. So we're going to dig into all of that today, which I know will be really helpful for the parents listening. But I'd love to start with, not with the goal of increasing people's anxiety, but let's get a hold on what is the epidemic of gun violence? How did we get here and what's really going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just to start, I think it's really important to understand that while gun violence does not discriminate, it can and does impact every type of person in every corner of our country. But communities are impacted at a disproportionate rate and impacted differently. So, for example, women in the US are 16 times more likely to be shot and killed than women in other developed nations. Let that sink in for a minute.
Yeah.
Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by gun homicide. Firearms, as of this year, are the leading cause of death for children and teens in America. LGBTQ hate crimes are on the rise, with half of the victims being killed by firearms. And in the Native American community, a young teen or child commits suicide with a gun every 6 days in the United States. So while it does impact everybody, there are groups of individuals that it impacts more. And sadly, American exceptionalism has now gotten us to the point where that includes all children and teens.
Wow. I mean, those are really, really sobering statistics, especially, this summit is targeting parents. So when we all think about the fact that our own children are vulnerable, here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've got folks attending from outside of the US, but, that's remarkable. And then when you think about, well, and I have to admit, I've fallen, prey to this, like thinking, well, women are just more vulnerable anyway in intimate partner violence. But to think that I think you said 6 times more likely to die by gun violence in the US than any other developed country is a really sobering statistic, especially as the mom of daughters.
And it's actually 16 times.
16 times. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Which is even more horrifying.
Yeah.
And as the mom of daughters and even those parents who have sons, I mean, that's just really devastating statistic. So what, you mentioned American exceptionalism and that we are excelling. What sets us apart from other similarly advantaged countries? What's different?
Yeah, what's different is how many guns we have in our culture. I'm just going to be really, really blunt. It is the guns. And yes, there are responsible gun owners. Yes, our Constitution has an amendment that gives us a right to carry firearms. But I think one of the biggest myths that the gun lobby has been really good at perpetuating is that a gun makes you safer. And it absolutely does not. Having a gun in your home makes you and your family less safe for every type of gun violence. That's suicide, that's homicide, that's intimate partner violence. And we know with gender-based violence, if there is a gun present in the home, typically a woman, not always, but typically the woman is 5 times more likely to be killed than if a gun is not in the home. And that's just one example. So I think really dispelling this myth that having a gun makes you safer. Now, there are some people who it might make feel safer, but they're not in reality safer. And I think that's a really, really important, just an important thing for people to understand. And we can get into more things about how, if you do choose to keep a firearm in your home, ways to mitigate that risk. But I think just understanding, in America, there are more guns than there are people. And if you think about that, and that is not true in most countries that are similarly advantaged as we are.
Okay. Wow. That's it. So
get some good news. I promise.
Yeah, yes, we will get to the good stuff. Well, and because parents are not, there are things that we can all do to keep as you said, to keep our individual family safer, if we have guns, to keep those safer. But I do think it's important to sort of get a grasp on the scope of the problem and why it's there, and that we do just have more guns available than in other locations in the world. And so I know that your organization is called the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. I think it's not gun abolition or taking down the Second Amendment, but I'd love to hear a little bit about, like, what is the Alliance? What is the how did it come to be? What is the work that your organization is doing to help parents like those listening keep their kids safer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Alliance for Gun Responsibility was born out of the tragedy at Sandy Hook, which, sort of the modern day gun violence prevention movement. A lot of renewed energy and I think creativity came after that horrific shooting, when we all thought that the federal government would finally do something. They didn't, clearly. And so in Washington State, we were lucky to have an amazing group of civic leaders and philanthropists come together and realize, like, we had to quit looking to the federal government and realize that there are things that we could do at home today. And that is how the Alliance was born. In 2014, we took our first initiative, statewide ballot initiative, to the people, to close very simple background check loopholes that we knew would save lives. And more than 60% of the voting population in Washington State voted for that initiative. And for people that aren't really familiar with ballot initiatives, that's a really good margin. That's an overwhelming majority of Washingtonians were sending a clear message that they wanted stronger gun laws. And that sort of started us off. Since then, we have passed another 2 statewide ballot initiatives in Washington. We also worked closely with the statewide ballot initiative in Washington around police accountability and training. We definitely acknowledge that police violence is part of gun violence, and there's really challenging and nuanced dynamics there, but that it's really important to acknowledge that. And then this year, we worked with our partners to pass a measure in Oregon State as well, that limited high capacity magazines and established a licensing system. In addition, we have been able to to elect for the first time a gun violence prevention majority in 2017 in the state legislature. And since then, we have just grown the margins of gun violence prevention champions in Olympia, which has allowed us to pass more than 35 common sense gun laws. And I'm happy to talk in some detail about what those are if you would like. But really amazing progress, including just this last year, passed restrictions on high capacity magazines in Washington State. We know that when a high capacity magazine is involved in a shooting, more people die. And so this is a really, really important law, and sort of I think the biggest banner law that we've passed through the state legislature so far. This year, we are going to be working on similar restrictions for semi-automatic assault rifles in general, as well as a number of other things. But we've also been able to, we think it's really important to stress that change starts locally. And so we also endorse and support candidates up and down the ballot. I think sometimes people think only about the sort of federal election and then the state, but really your local school boards, your city councils, and your county councils. We might pass laws at the state level, but implementation happens locally. And so we have to have elected officials that are willing to prioritize, both in terms of saying this is a priority, but then also backing that up with funding for implementation.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point for the parents who are listening, that this doesn't have to be this big national. I mean, there are national organizations working on this, but that it matters even at that local level, the school board level, the county, or the city or county council level, that there's an impact that can be made there to help keep our kids safer. I'll also note, I know ballot initiatives are not something that happen in every state, right? Washington does things differently than many other states, but I really appreciate you talking about that sort of voting process and that 60% majority that voted, because as a fellow Washingtonian, I know that is a really large majority for a ballot initiative.
It is. And the ballot initiative we took 2 years later, extreme risk protection orders, which are a really, really vital tool for preventing all kinds of gun violence, passed with nearly 70% of the state vote. And I think what's important, sort of drawing the lens up about that, is our politicians love to make this, not so much anymore, but make this issue one that they say they're going to lose elections around, et cetera. And the bottom line is, for the voting population in the United States, this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. When you have 70% of the statewide vote going in favor, the people in general are saying Republicans, Democrats, independents, women, men, gun owners, non-gun owners are voting for common sense gun laws. And so, I know our politicians are often a lagging indicator of where the people are. And with gun violence, that is definitely true. I think in Washington state, because of a lot of hard work with thousands of volunteers across our state, our politicians are finally catching up.
Yeah. And I think that's such a good point about it. I mean, we see that in a number of different areas where the politicians are a little behind the rest of the right, the voting people. And I really appreciate you saying that this isn't a one party issue. This isn't a one gender issue. This is men, women, Republicans, Democrats, gun owners, non-gun owners, that recognize that there are things that we can do to keep ourselves, keep our children, keep our partners, our communities safer when we make some common sense decisions. And I think that's there's some hope in that, right? Because in a time when I feel like we don't come together on very much, and the media loves to sow that the divisiveness of so many different things, to know that really we've got people from every corner coming together on this, I think is important to recognize and to celebrate a little bit. You've talked a lot about, the amazing things that you've done here in Washington. I know you mentioned that you also partnered with folks down in Oregon, but I'd love to hear kind of how that work is impacting people more nationally and changing the conversation on a broader scale.
Yeah, well, I would say, and I say this with great humility, because it's not about me or my organization, it's about the people in Washington who have really stepped up and demanded the change that we're making happen. But Washington really is a leader in state-based change. And what we're seeing at the federal level is that a lot of things that we have been able to pass and implement here are things that are now showing up at the federal level. Now, while the big policies have not passed out of both chambers yet, this year there was, I should say last year, it's 2023 now, last year there was an amazing bipartisan Safer Communities Act that did pass. And I know for a lot of people, it felt like it wasn't enough, and I agree it wasn't enough, but we had not had anything happen at the federal level in more than 30 years. And it's really good to remember that even in Washington State, where it feels like we've done a lot in a very short period of time, the first year the Alliance started, the legislature, which had Democratic leadership, said there's no way we're ever going to do anything here. And so to have that first sort of hurdle jumped it is a really big deal, and it's something to be celebrated. And within that act, there is really important funding that is going to be coming down to the state and local level that will help with the implementation of extreme risk protection orders, which is so vitally important. They are an amazing tool that allow family members and law enforcement. It's a civil process to petition the court to temporarily remove firearms from individuals that are presenting as if they are going to be a danger to themselves or others. And we're starting to see early research come out that it is having an impact on driving down suicide. It is in some states used for domestic violence. In Washington State, we have another protection order that is used for domestic violence, but also having impact on domestic violence. And we know that more than 50% of mass shooters have a history of domestic violence. So there's definitely a link between gender-based violence and mass shootings that's really important to acknowledge and sort of get at.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then just the suicide prevention of ERPOs is huge. And I should have said at the beginning, I think when we think about gun violence in America, we tend to think about mass shootings. And I'm going to be really honest here. We tend to think about mass shootings that happen in predominantly white communities. And that is what gets centered. And that is not the face of gun violence in America. The face of gun violence in America is that more than 60% of firearm deaths are death by suicide. And if you really think about that, the mass shootings are a very, very, very small percentage of what gun violence really is in the United States.
Which I think is such an important point, because I know, obviously Sandy Hook was a horrific event that spurred the formation of the Alliance. And last year in 2022, there was Uvalde and a number of other, things that happened around the country. But as a parent myself, those are often the things that come to mind when I'm thinking about gun violence and my children. And I appreciate that you're pointing out that suicide is really the predominant way that we're seeing gun violence impact people and our kids in particular. And we know that suicide risk is on the rise, or suicidality is on the rise among tweens and teens and even younger kids these days. And so that's made easier to accomplish when there's a firearm handy or available to the person that is in that place. So as we think about this sort of from a parent standpoint, because what I'm hearing you say in terms of even some federal legislation that took place in 2022, some of the, more state-based things, like there's a lot of reason for hope, because we are seeing larger swaths of the population say, yes, we need some, we need some help around this. And I think there's lots of ways, and I want to give you a chance to talk about ways that parents can get involved in that larger conversation. But I know parents who are listening are also saying, okay, I understand these statistics are terrible. What can I do in my home? How do I talk to my children, whether they're white, Black, or some other, come from some other minority? How do we talk to our kids about this? And what are things that parents need to be thinking about doing and working on just in that home space?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really important question. And there definitely are things that can be done in your home. I already mentioned that just understanding the facts and that the choice to own a firearm does put your family at greater risk, I think is really important. And that is not said in a shaming way. That is not said in a judgmental way. Just understanding. I think it's important. We all want to know what could cause greater risk for our kids in so many different ways. And this is one. But if you do choose to own a firearm, there are ways that you can mitigate that risk. And safe storage is one of those ways. And safe storage means storing your firearms, preferably in a lockbox or a safe that your children do not know how to get access to, and storing ammunition separately. And also locked. So that is sort of best practice in terms of safe storage. I think the other thing that's really important, most school shooters do access firearms, and I know that's a big fear of people, do access firearms from either their own home or a home of a friend or family. And so not just in your own home, but really getting comfortable with having the conversation with friends and family where your children are. Do you own a firearm? Again, said without judgment. If you do you store it safely? And having that conversation, which can be super awkward at first, but I have a daughter and I've gotten used to having that conversation. And I think it's really important. And the more we normalize that, the safer we'll be across the board.
Yes. I just want to pipe in there and say that is something that I talk about in all the safety presentations that I give around, because the presentations I give are predominantly child sexual abuse prevention, but I talk about play dates and the questions that we need to ask. And I always encourage parents to ask about that one. And what I have found is that it is so much easier. Well, two things that I've heard parents say are easier. One is to do it over text message, or to say, hey, this is the situation in our home, curious what the situation is in your home, so that it's sharing equally. And then two, and I will give every listener permission to say this, hey, I heard this talk between Renee and Christy, and, to have sort of that third party scapegoat. I recently heard this talk and I was reminded that I should ask this. So it feels weird, but I'm going to do it anyway. And when we can sort of blame someone else for that awkwardness, parents love to be able to do that and to say, someone told me that I should do this.
Yes, please blame me. I'm happy to take that.
Yeah.
Blame me. And then I think the other thing that's really important to remember, and this is true with suicide, this is true with school shootings, often, not always, but often, in the vast majority of times, kids will share that they are having thoughts, and they often will share with their peers, but they're share on social media, but there are often signs that are there. And so just if you hear something, say something. If you see something, say something, and encourage your children to do that. To find a trusted adult, whether it be a parent, a teacher, a principal. And if you are worried or see something that you think is not quite right, share that information. It's really, really important. I think it's really important to understand that gun violence is preventable. It's preventable in all of its forms. And, but it takes us doing things to prevent it.
Right. I think that's such an important point, especially in the conversations with our kids, because I know the older they get, and I have a teenager, they think they're capable of handling things themselves.
Yeah.
And reminding them that there are some things they just need help with.
Yeah.
And a peer feeling suicidal, talking about guns or any of that seems like one of those things that our kids need to be reminded, like, I would get help if I heard about that, right? They need to get help if they hear about that.
Yeah. And then that's really the brave and strong thing to do.
Yeah. And I know a lot of them worry about getting somebody in trouble when they were just joking around. Do you have any suggestions for ways parents can address that with their kids? I know you're a parent as well. I'd love some tips for folks on, like, how do we broach that conversation? Because I know a lot of times tweens and teens are likely to say, I got it. No, none of my friends would ever do that. It's fine, mom. It's fine, dad, And as we've heard a lot throughout this summit, we still have to push through and have those conversations about difficult stuff.
Yeah.
Any tips around that?
Well, I am not a parenting specialist, so I just want to give that caveat.
Yeah.
But but I am a parent of a teenage daughter who's 17. And I think, we're at a unique time in our country right now where it's no secret that depression amongst teens, suicidality amongst teens and even younger, especially one of the largest growing populations that are at risk for suicide by firearm are very young Black boys. And we're talking 8, 9, 10 years old. That is a demographic that is growing exponentially. So I think, having the conversation in the context of it's a really hard time right now, and we know that. And whether your child individually is struggling, I guarantee some of their friends are. I mean, it's inevitable that at this point, and there are many different reasons for that, not least of which is COVID.
Right.
An impact. But I think it's an opening, and just to be really honest about it's a hard time. People are struggling. And if you yourself feel in danger of hurting yourself or others, if you have friends that do, please know that is something that is can be fleeting, and that there is help. You don't have to live in that space. And I think just, again, having that really open and honest conversation. And my deal with my daughter is you can share anything with me. And the only time that I will reach out to other parents is if there is something that really suggests that your friend might be in danger of something. And so I think just having those open, honest conversations. And I also think sharing that maybe you have struggled, someone in your family has struggled, like sort of normalizing it and normalizing that not only do we all struggle at times, but those feelings are not permanent.
Yeah. One thing I notice about sort of the young generation now is they are better at talking about mental health issues than many of us of my age. And yet we're still seeing an increase in harm being done. And so there's kind of this divide, like we're starting to remove the taboo a little bit, getting there.
Yeah.
But there's, we're still seeing an increase in gun violence and suicide by other methods, which I think just speaks to the importance of having those conversations. I'd love to talk a little bit, Renee, about because I'm hearing you loud and clear that really suicidality, death by firearm by suicide, or suicide by firearm, to put my words in the right order, is really what is the biggest kind of threat to our kids. And there are a lot of parents, and I am not immune to this, who have some anxiety about events like Uvalde, like Sandy Hook, right? Where they think, what do I do about this? How do I talk to my kids? Or is there something I need to be doing to keep my children safer at school? How does the Alliance address that or talk about that? And how can we talk about that with our kids?
Yeah, I think it's really important these incidents rock us to our core, right? They do.
Yeah.
And I'm also not immune to that in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's really important to set context. And it is still true that schools, by and large, are very, very safe. And that the vast majority of death by firearm does not happen in schools.
Yeah.
Majority for teens and youth, more than half of suicide or of death by firearms by suicide. And even taking that out, there's a growing or a huge number of homicides that don't ever touch the schools. A lot of our youth are more in danger walking to and from school, going to their local parks. And so I think really understanding that the schools in general are still safe. But within that context, I would also go back to, if you hear something, see something, say something, because school shootings are preventable. We know this, this. And then the other thing I would say is really advocate within your schools, within your school boards, with your state legislature, for dissemination of information about safety, for safe storage of prescription drugs and firearms, really helping to get as much information about the facts and dispel myths into the hands of parents as possible. And really, again, trying to break down the taboo around talking about firearms and other things. I mean, again, prescription drugs also a huge issue. So I think that is the best advice that I have. What we do know is that there is no evidence whatsoever that arming teachers would help a situation. So I think, in fact, like I said, having a firearm present makes everything more dangerous. So I know sometimes in our sort of fear reaction in certain parts of our state and our country, there's sort of this, okay, well, if we just arm everyone, then it will be safer. And that is not backed by any evidence whatsoever. In fact, scary.
Yeah, which I think is important to recognize. And what we need to do is be talking about, how do we safely store these things? How do we keep them out of the hands of kids and adults who would do harm? And then, having those conversations, which I know is really difficult. I also have a 5-year-old, a kindergartner, and, it's terrifying to think that I need to talk with her about, what those safety drills are at school. And when I was growing up, it was the fire drill. We did stop, drop, and roll. Right. And in Washington, we did earthquake drills.
Right.
Right. And now they've added on Alice drills, which is sort of those safety, worst case scenario kind of drills. And that's a tough thing to explain to a child. So I really appreciate your reminding all of us that that's not really the predominant concern for our kids. In fact, it sounds like we need to look closer to home for where to be concerned.
100%. Even in preventing the rare school shootings that do happen, we still need to look closer to home.
Yeah.
Where those guns are being accessed is in the homes. And that's really, really, we all have the power to be part of the answer and the solution and prevention of these very preventable events.
So when we talk, sorry.
The other thing I would say is, be educated about the kinds of drills that are happening in schools. And, in Washington state, for the most part, Alice is what is used. But active shooter drills are absolutely not appropriate for children. There's nothing to say that they help prevent or save lives if there is an incident. And they do cause great trauma. So if you live in a district where there are active shooter drills, I would be advocating strongly against those, because they have not shown to be helpful in terms of preventing death if there is an incident, and they have shown to be harmful for the psychology of our children.
So I'd love to have you explain a little bit, because I'm not sure that even I know, what is the difference between an Alice drill, which, as you said, we use here in Washington, and likely in other locations as well, and an active shooter drill? How do those differ?
Yeah, and I can't go into detail about Alice. I just know it's not an active shooter drill, but active shooter drills are when you actually have someone enter a school room, a lunchroom, with a firearm, play out what a shooting would actually be. At the kids in some cases, which is just, you can imagine, would be so traumatizing. And again, there's no evidence to show that they have a preventative nature. So I think that is if there are any sort of someone that is acting out an actual shooting, I would be advocating so strongly.
Yeah.
The school board or state, wherever it differs state by state in terms of where those policies are set.
I mean, I think for me as an adult, like if there was an active shooter drill in a workplace, that would be incredibly traumatizing. Right.
Sure.
And I'm a, nearly 50-year-old woman, like that would be terrifying. So to think about that in the context of our young children, yeah, I hear you. And I know, I also don't know the details of Alice in great detail, although it has been, I know we've received information from our schools, but it's a much, there's no acting involved, and it's a much more sort of generic safety drill.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think is if we have to do them, that's what I would be advocating for my child.
Okay.
The other thing I just want to mention, which not to get too off topic, but I just want to make sure that I say this. There's also around suicide this myth that if someone wants to kill themselves, they're going to figure out how to do it.
Mm.
And there is really, really strong research that has been done over and over again that really show that means matter, and that suicide is a very in the moment, reactionary, impulsive act, and that people who attempt suicide and do not die by suicide at that attempt, only 10% of them ever go on to die by suicide in the future. And if you attempt suicide with a firearm, it's 90 to 95% likely that suicide will be completed. And that is not true with other forms of attempted suicide. So that firearm suicide is, that split-second decision, there's almost always no going back from that.
Yeah.
So again, just to sort of put that myth that's out there around, if someone wants to kill themselves, they'll figure it out, just does not pan out. And if you attempt in another way, your likelihood of survival is far greater. And then your likelihood of going on to die by suicide in the future is very low.
I think that is such important information, and frankly gives a lot of hope, because for parents who do worry about kids with depression and who are dealing with all the things this world throws at them right now, right? That there is some hope that they, first of all, will be okay if they have attempted by some other means, that they can recover from that, and that statement that means matter, because I've also heard that myth, right? That I think that's perpetuated in a number of different ways in our culture, that sort of idea that means don't matter, that someone's going to do it, by hook or by crook. And so to hear that that's not the reality, and that we can prevent this with safe policies and around firearms is, I think for me, it provides a lot of hope, actually. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. What are there other things? I mean, you've talked about obviously the conversations that parents have with their children. We've talked about safe gun storage, and you also mentioned safe storage of other things like prescription drugs. I would also throw in there marijuana edibles. We're seeing an increase in overdose of young children with edibles. So safe storage of all those sort of dangerous objects, but firearms being among the most dangerous. You've talked about advocating at your local school board and, county council or city council, sort of at that level. Are there other things that parents can do to keep our community safer, especially given, as you described, that this does not impact every community equally?
It really doesn't. Yeah, I think it's really important. I mentioned at the top of this that we have really tended to center the impact on white bodies more than we have on our communities of color, on Black and brown bodies. And we've been really intentional at the Alliance, and I think the overall gun violence prevention movement is being more intentional, maybe not enough, but we're on the journey of really making sure that in addition to advocating for stronger laws, we're also advocating for things that really are community-based solutions. We know that there are a lot of proven community-based violence intervention, prevention, and interruption programs. And they need funding. They need sustainable funding. The federal government passed, as part of the Safer Communities Act, there will also be a lot of funding coming down to community-based organizations. In the state of Washington in 2019, we helped lead a coalition that fought for the establishment of an Office of Firearms Safety and Violence Prevention. It's a mouthful, and it's the first of its kind, a state level organization that is responsible for keeping data around gun violence, as well as prioritizing funding through grants for community-based solutions. And so while we want to, while we don't want to ignore what's happening in our schools, we also want to keep in mind that it's really important that our leaders who are making decisions about how our tax dollars are spent are also prioritizing funding of community-based solutions that do help communities that are highly disproportionately impacted by homicide in particular, but as we already talked about, also growing suicide.
Yeah. I obviously, for those who are listening who live in Washington, I know there are ways to get involved with the Alliance. We also have people obviously attending from all over. What would be a few first steps that you might recommend for someone who's like, okay, I feel like this is an issue I'd like to get more deeply involved in? How would someone get started on that journey?
Yeah, well, if you're in Washington, definitely the Alliance for Gun Responsibility. We make it really easy for people to get involved. We are constantly sending out different opportunities for people to advocate with their local, state, and federal electeds. And I think this is really important. We know that states that have stronger gun laws have less gun deaths, period. And so advocating for stronger common sense, stronger gun laws is just vitally important. And there's a lot of hope in that. And I will mention, and then I'll get back to other action steps, one of the glimmers of hope that we're seeing in Washington state. We passed a number of common sense gun laws that are really aimed at suicide prevention, as I mentioned. When the pandemic hit, I was, and many people in our space were just really scared about what was going to happen with suicide. And we anticipated a huge spike. Nationally, there was a spike, not huge. With firearm suicide, there was about a 4% increase in the country. In Washington state, we actually saw a 4% decrease in suicide.
Wow.
And what that translates into in Washington state is more than 25 lives saved, or 25 fewer people died. And when you think about what that means, that's 25 fewer families impacted, communities impacted.
Yeah.
And that is, that's significant. I mean, in my opinion, one life is significant.
Yes. Yeah.
Really, and that's a hopeful sign that the passage of these laws, while they take time to start showing impact, that there's hope there. So
yes,
all of that to say, advocate. And if that means sending an email, making a phone call, legislators count the emails that they get. When you get something saying contact your legislator, it matters. And they look at how many they're getting from the opposition, how many they're getting from gun rights advocates, how many they're getting from gun safety advocates. And so it really is important. Those contacts matter. So email, phone calls, and again, we make it really easy. And other groups around the country do as well. And also, if you get an opportunity to meet with your elected official, do that. Really let them know that this issue matters. I would also say that when you're voting, look and see who has endorsed the candidates. Yeah. And if there is, in Washington state, obviously, an alliance endorsement, that means that they're good on this issue, and this should be a voting issue. If you're not in Washington state, if they have a Moms Demand Action endorsement, that also means they're good on this issue. And there are a number of national organizations, Everytown for Gun Safety, Giffords, Brady. So if you don't live in Washington State, there are other opportunities for you. But I would also encourage you to really do some digging to see if there's a state-based organization. Because again, we know that change starts locally, and tapping into your local organizations to help with that local advocacy is really vitally important.
Yeah.
We will even trickle up here. So well, the things that we do locally do end up impacting at the national level eventually.
Well, yeah, and I was just thinking about it, when you say, oh, we need to tackle gun violence at a national level, that feels really overwhelming and sort of, I think a lot of us, even when we're worried about it, we bury our heads in the sand because what am I going to do about this on a national level? But when we say, oh, all you need to do is work at your school board level or your city council level, and then that trickles out and up, as you said, strikes me that there's a lot that feels a lot more manageable for parents.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, at the end of these conversations in the summit, I've been asking everyone, what are 3 steps that parents could take? We've just talked about a lot of different ways for parents to tackle this and to keep their kids safer. But I wonder if you might distill that down into sort of 3 quick action steps that everyone can take really easily, in pretty short order.
Yeah, and I would start with in your own home, the things we talked about. Talk to your kids, safely store, be really clear about the decision you're making to own or not own a firearm. Outside of your home, encourage your kids if they see or hear something to say something. And then out the next circle, advocate at your local level, make sure you're voting in a way that is continuing to promote gun violence prevention champions. Volunteer, give of your time. And then last I will say is also give of your treasure. If you are someone that has the means to donate to organizations that are working in this space, please do. We can't do it without people investing, and we are really good return on investment.
Yeah, great suggestions. I know we'll include the Alliance's web address and where people can sort of get connected with you. Is there anywhere else that people should go? I know you mentioned a couple other organizations for those who are not in Washington State, and we can list those for parents as well. Is there any other place where people can go or should be going after the conclusion of this to get sort of up-to-date, regular information on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would really encourage people, especially outside of Washington State, Giffords and Everytown do, I think, a really nice job of sort of ranking where the states are in terms of gun laws. So go to one of those sites, and it's very, very easy to navigate and look at where your state is. They give them grades. They have very clear, like, here are the laws that your state has. Here are the laws that would make your state safer. So just educate yourself so that when you are advocating, you really know what to be advocating for. There's a lot more research coming out now that's really showing what is effective in terms of gun violence prevention. And those are 2 very trusted sites in terms of learning about wherever you might be across the country.
Fantastic. Well, we will obviously make sure everyone knows how to find the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, because whether you're in Washington or not, I know you've got great resources on your site, have been doing great work, and as you said, are kind of a leader in how this work can be done in your homes, in that slightly broader circle, and on a bigger level. Renee, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for the work that you're doing, in my community. But for really talking today about what parents can do, what we need to worry about, and what we can maybe not worry about so much. So I think that's a really important piece of all of this. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for being willing to talk about an issue that can make people feel uncomfortable. And it doesn't have to.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed that interview with Renee. As I said during the introduction, I learned a lot from her, and I hope that you did as well. I hope that it spurred some ideas in your mind and maybe has given you a little bit of permission to have those uncomfortable conversations and, to ask other families where your child hangs out whether or not they have any firearms, and if they do, how those firearms are kept and stored. I think that's really an important piece of all of this. If we do nothing else moving forward, then ensure that we are asking that question. This interview, this session, this podcast episode will have been worth it. I will look forward to seeing you back next week. And I just want to say, as I always do, thank you for being a part of the community, the Heartful Parent Podcast community. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for you. Cheers.